Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Jeremy Schumacher. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm the Jer in Wellness with Jer. Thanks for checking out my channel today. Today, we're going to talk about one of my favorite graphic novels from 2022, The Crimson Cage. You have to say it that way because it's kind of spooky. Uh, this is by John Lees and Alex Cormack and Ashley Cormack did the art. John Lees is the writer. And I don't know who the letterer is off the top of my head. It's not on the front of the book. I feel badly for not calling out or shouting out the letterer. Graphic novels, I've talked about this before, are just like an awesome medium, but it takes a team, right? It takes a team of people. So there's somebody who does like the letters and the coloring and the artwork, and yeah, it's a whole thing. So the Crimson Cage is basically a modern retelling of Macbeth through 1980s Southern wrestling territories. So I love pro wrestling. I have freshly squeezed Orange Cassidy shirt on, who you may never have heard of. And if you've never heard of him, just go YouTube him, because I guarantee one of the top things that come up will make you laugh, because he's hilarious. He's one of the best wrestlers on the planet right now, and he does not get enough credit or respect for that, because people think it's just a comedy act, but he's very good at wrestling. Wrestling's all sorts of different things. Wrestling is comedy, wrestling is drama, wrestling's tragedy, wrestling is the underdog taking on somebody who's totally overpowered, immovable force meeting an unstoppable, or immovable object meeting an unstoppable force. Like, wrestling is theater, it's soap opera, it's athleticism, it's sport, and it's all kind of mishmashed together. I love pro wrestling, and when it's done well, it's some of the best storytelling that can be done. I think when pro wrestling is done well, it's one of, if not the best medium for storytelling available. People like opera, right? Like, there's music in pro wrestling. There's theater. It's just so. Unfortunately, it's just not done well very often. Or for a long time, a company, WWF, for those of you who grew up a long time ago, WWE now, it just did such a poor job for such a long time. Late stage capitalism affecting everything, right? Like, we had a rich old white man in charge for way too long. He might be back in charge now. I'm not going to get into the wrestling dirt sheet drama. Wrestling has its own lingo as well, which I'll talk about a little bit. I'm super off topic because I'm so thrilled to have an excuse to talk about pro wrestling. Getting back on track. Wrestling is not done well. We had Vince McMahon, a rich old white man who's pretty out of touch with modern storytelling techniques and just modern audiences in general, was running his show with like a micromanaging approach for so long that pro wrestling really like became kind of a laughing stock, and it was for a while anyway. So pro wrestling came out of like, it was its own thing, and then it kind of got attached to like the carnival, and being kind of carny. And so there's a lot of it that comes from that. Wrestlers would travel around with the local fairs or carnival scene and put on, shows from town to town, and that's how it kind of went around. It's kind of how it got the carny backing to it. So Crimson Cage is set in the 1980s, which is pre-WWF. What happened with like WWF and WCW and a lot of wrestling being really popular in the 90s was these big corporations that had TV deals bought up a lot of the independent promotions, or a lot of the regional promotions. And so back in the 80s, it was much more a regional thing. So it'd be like Mid-South, there'd be a Memphis territory, there'd be an Atlanta territory, there'd be North Carolina territory. Ric Flair is out of the North Carolina territory. Jerry Lawler, who's one of the announcers for WWE, or used to be. I think he's hospitalized now. He's old, but still wrestles occasionally. That's a whole separate topic. Old wrestlers not retiring, and yeah, that's why The Wrestler, the Darren Aronofsky film, was a thing. Like, that's based in real life of wrestlers going out and like doing it well beyond when they should be able to do it, and it's not safe. Anyway, so this is set in a different time, 1980s. John Lees, the writer, talks about how he's a big pro wrestling fan. Like, he talks about one of his most recent matches, which I know which one he's talking about because I'm a wrestling fan. Brock Lesnar versus, who at the time, Bryan Daniel, now going by what he used to go by, which is Bryan Danielson. Arguably one of the greatest of all time. against Brock Lesnar. Not one of the greatest of all time, but one of the greatest specimen of all time. I'll give him a shout out because he's an alum. He went to the University of Minnesota, which is where I went. Two-time NCAA champion, just saying. So John Lees knows his stuff, but again, setting it in that 1980s time, because it was just a different vibe back then. Like, there weren't TV deals. It was a way to make good money for people who were at the top, but for like the guys trying to break through, the regional system wasn't super helpful in the way that like a lot of indie wrestlers now can wrestle on the indies for a couple of years and then they'll get scooped up by one of the major companies. So I don't know that like in 2023 is when I'm filming this. I don't know if there's a better time in pro wrestling to make money for just people, because there's such a wide audience for it. There's such a mass appeal for getting wrestlers who are good and can connect with an audience and be safe in the ring and do it well. They just get scooped up and they get contracts with some longevity attached to them. There's still problems in pro wrestling. Like, AEW gives some people contracts with like health insurance and stuff, but like WWE still doesn't. It's still like independent contractors, and it totally shouldn't be, and that's a separate topic. I believe John Oliver did a video a couple years ago on like a lot of the issues with WWE, and spoiler alert, none of them got fixed. So, but yeah, and then I know whenever you're going to talk about pro wrestling, you're going to get those people who are like, oh, excuse me, just so you know, that's fake. Sure, great. Pat yourself on the back for knowing that a scripted television show is fake. Game of Thrones is also fake. So wrestling is predetermined. And again, for a long time, coming out of the 1980s, wrestlers and promoters and everybody else who was kind of involved with wrestling at a professional level really worked hard to protect that side of the business, that it was scripted, that it was fake. So they worked hard to make sure like Andre the Giant and Hulk Hogan, when they were fighting each other, were never like seen together out in public, even though like they traveled together and would go get breakfast and whatever. I don't know if Hulk and Andre actually did that, but like, you know, other people, like people behind the scenes, like they're wrestlers, they're friends, they're buddies, they travel from town to town together, they spend a lot of time together, they have to work together in the ring to put on a match, to have a wrestling a sporting event that's choreographed come across as real, and do the theater that requires the audience to get invested in that match. So like they're working together, it's a collaborative process. And so for a long time the business was protected. It's called kayfabe, which means like the in-universe storytelling, that heels, who are the bad guys, and faces, who are the good guys, don't get along and don't like each other. But like, again, these people are spending a ton of time together. These are co-workers. They're people who care about each other and care about each other's safety. Bret Hart, who's one of the best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be. Again, in the conversation for greatest of all time, he often would talk about how like good pro wrestling should look like it hurts, but do actually very little damage. That's why he hated open hand chops. He hated knife edge chops because they don't do a ton of damage. You're never going to win a match with them, but they actually hurt a lot in real life. So this is just me nerding out about talking about pro wrestling. I love pro wrestling. I'm a nerd about it. I watch All Elite Wrestling, which is where Orange Cassidy wrestles, and I watch New Japan Pro Wrestling. I don't watch a ton of WWE because I still think like it hasn't gotten out of its own way from a storytelling perspective. WWE is very much like the spectacle of pro wrestling without doing the storytelling. And AEW gets caught up in that a little bit sometimes, but for the most part, I think AEW is a younger company. They've been around for 3 years. They do a much better job with storytelling. WWE is coming off like a great story with Sami Zayn and Roman Reigns and the Bloodline, and everybody's like oohing and eyeing over it, and it's like, it was very well done. That's what wrestling should always be, not like, oh, like, look at, we had one good story we told in the last decade. Like, it should always be good. We should always have this stuff. So, yeah, I have opinions on pro wrestling. But the Crimson Cage, getting back on topic. The Crimson Cage, I have the trade paperback here because this is when I first started getting back into like comics and going into a comic shop, and I didn't understand that you had to like pre-order stuff ahead of time, otherwise they wouldn't print it and or buy it. So my local comic shop did not have all of them, so I have some of the standalone issues. The artwork, especially the cover art, is like really good. It's very like kind of macabre like this. I'll take some stills and have it edited in. but I really like the artwork and the style, kind of catching that like 1980s vibe, but also that like tragedy kind of horror story of Macbeth. So it's set in Louisiana. Um, there's ghosts. I don't know. I feel like I can spoil it because it's based on Macbeth, which came out in like the 1500s. Um, which I have opinions on Shakespeare too. This is a terrible topic for me because I'm going to soapbox on a bunch of different things. Shakespeare was very good at writing in iambic pentameter. He was very good at rhyming, although to take a little bit of his credibility away, he made up a lot of words that weren't in the lexicon at that point. So like, sure, shout out to him for creating a lot of words that we didn't have before, but also like I feel like that'd be saying like Snoop Dogg's very good at rhyming, and Snoop Dogg is very good at rhyming, but there's also kind of like a memification of Snoop Dogg just adding like izzle to everything and making that rhyme, and like that's not actually good rhyming. So I take some issue with like Shakespeare being all the jam, and the fact that like we still study him regularly in like high school. Like he wasn't even the most popular playwright of his time. That was Christopher Marlowe. How many Christopher Marlowe plays do we still study? We don't even have very many of them anymore. Like it's not a thing that's been kept around. So like Shakespeare being at the top and like unequivocally best playwright of all time, like nah, I disagree. Shakespeare never wrote an original play. All of his plays were modern retellings. So that is what Crimson Cage is. It's a modern retelling of Macbeth, in the same way that like West Side Story is a modern retelling of Romeo and Juliet, in the same way that Romeo and Juliet was a modern retelling of Pyramus and Thisbe, which was from like Latin times. I translated it in Latin class. That's why I know about it. So Shakespeare, Hamlet was a retelling of the Dutch tale of Amleth. He was so lazy he didn't even bother to like come up with a new name. He just rearranged the letters. So it's the contrarian in me taking issue with Shakespeare just being kind of like forcibly studied. I don't necessarily agree with. Like, I think there's a lot of great plays, and in high school literature, we should study plays, I guess, I think. But like always having to do Romeo and Juliet, like, nah, like update that, find an updated version of it. That's all Shakespeare did, was update things for a modern audience. So that's what Crimson Cage is. Although like 1980s was 30 years ago already, so I'm not sure how modern of an audience, but I think it's geared, like I'm the target audience, right? Like I grew up with Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock, Undertaker, Mankind, Chris Jericho. I'll throw Triple H in there, but I don't want to. So like wrestling at its peak was Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock. And so Dwayne Johnson, who's had the most crossover success. So definitely for me, growing up in the late 90s, like wrestling was at its peak. That was the Monday Night Wars. WCW was still really good and had people like Bret Hart and Goldberg and a bunch of other big names like the New Age or the Outsiders. Kevin Nash and Scott Hall were over there. I usually start like do a lot of things with like, hey, yo. That's a normal greeting for me. That's a Scott Hall reference. Not when he was in WCW, though. One of my very good friends who also likes wrestling is, we're friends because I sent a work email that started with "Hey yo," and he was like, "I just need to ask if you're a fan of pro wrestling." And so, like, he got the reference right away. I will also often refer to people as peeps. Like, that's also a pro wrestling reference. So, like, I have a lot of lingo that's just taken from pro wrestling because I grew up with it. Not that I got to watch it in my house. We didn't have cable, and we definitely weren't going to pay for pay-per-views, and it was inappropriate, so it was frowned upon. But I go to friends' houses and watch it, or see it and hear my cousins talk about it or whatever. So yeah, I think I'm the target audience. Millennials. I'm like smack dab in the middle of being a millennial, but I think I lean elder millennial. And so like, yeah, I think it's the audience is like people who grew up. Like I remember Ric Flair. He was still an active wrestler. I watched his retirement match at WrestleMania against Shawn Michaels. So like Ric Flair came out of the 80s. Macho Man Randy Savage was in like the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie. Bonesaw McGraw was his name in that movie. Randy Savage is awesome. If you don't know Randy Savage, you should look him up. Ric Flair is like this larger than life character. Arguably not a very good human being, but like, hey, that's also a very common trope in pro wrestling, which the book covers. Man, I'm like 15 minutes in already. So, Crimson Cage is set in the 1980s in Louisiana. I liked the setting of Louisiana, one, because like it fits really well for the territories and encapsulates a lot of what wrestling was like back in the time. As somebody who's written like college papers on pro wrestling, like Roland Bout, Barthes is how I, as a Midwesterner, would read it, but it's Bouth. He was a French philosopher. He wrote about pro wrestling. On my bookshelf behind the camera over there, I have Guy Debose, another French philosopher. The Society of the Spectacle, and so like I used those both in college in my cultural studies minor to write papers about pro wrestling, because I just like to write about things that I liked, and pro wrestling is kind of like you can always tie pro wrestling in the same way that I used either Pink Floyd or System of a Down for nearly all of the introductions in my paper. Like, I don't know, there's just art that's done really well. You can use it to be about almost anything. So 1980s, Chuck Frenzy is our main character, which is a great name. I've been reading a lot of graphic novels that have great names. I just finished reading, or I just not. I haven't read all of it, but I read the first omnibus of, or compendium, I don't know what the difference between those is, of Something's Killing the Children. Maybe I'll do a review of that. Maybe I will do a review of that. I'm talking so excitedly because I'm just thrilled to be talking about pro wrestling. But Jessica Slaughter is in there. Like, that's a great name. Sergeant Slaughter was a pro wrestler in the 80s. So yeah, Chuck Frenzy is a great pro wrestling name. I love that. He at some point wrestles Van Emerald, which another good character name. He's very clearly based off of Ric Flair and the idea of the Four Horsemen. So it's Van Emerald and the Diamond Brothers are in there. And so, like, yeah, this idea of the Four Horsemen. Wrestling has a lot of factions. Faction is a group of wrestlers. So Van Emerald's the champion, and he's coming into town, and Chuck Frenzy is going to get to wrestle him. Chuck's like the big name in the local promotion, which means he has like no national coverage and nobody knows who he is, but in like that Louisiana promotion, he's a big deal. And so he and one of his other wrestlers are, out drinking. They have this great match. They're buddies. So, like, again, breaking kayfabe, they're out at the bar together and whatever. And then some fans come in, right? So they have to like take a shortcut and they have to go through the bayou because they don't want the fans to see them together, because that would break kayfabe. So, like, again, the setting in the 1980s is important to the story. So then they run into some witches in the bayou, which is very much the Macbeth storyline, right? And so Chuck Frenzy, the witches say, like, we're not cursing you or whatever, like, we're just telling you this is what happened. This is what's going to happen. You're going to get to be the title. You're going to be a big deal, but you're only going to have one title reign, and that's it. And this is enough to drive him crazy. And that's really what Macbeth is about. So, like, Macbeth is about, like, who's the heir to the throne and getting cursed by some ghost and losing your mind. Super fun. So, like, because pro wrestling is already theater, which I usually refer to pro wrestling as, like, athletic theater, as opposed to anything else. Like, pro wrestlers are insane athletes. The risks they take are real. Like, the art they're doing is risky. They get hurt. Like, even if you're intentionally cutting your forehead so that you bleed in a match to heighten the drama, like, it still hurts. You still have to get stitches, or you still have to staple that up. Sometimes stuff goes wrong and people hit one of the metal ring posts and get busted open. Hard way. Wrestling has its own lingo. So they do damage. They get hurt. Their shoulders get popped out. Concussions are a part of the sport. And the sport's done a lot better job of protecting wrestlers and watching out for stuff like that. But again, I'm getting off topic. So they run into the Bayou Witches, and Chuck starts to lose his mind. Chuck is married to Charlene. Love it. 1980s in the South, pro wrestler. Great. So she's also a wrestler, and she also goes crazy, like, just loses her mind. So Van Emerald comes into town, and he says he's going to put Chuck over. Van Emerald has a finisher that nobody's ever kicked out of before. So a finisher is like that finishing move. It's what you do at the end of the match to win the match. And he is talking to Chuck behind the scenes, like, yeah, I'm going to put you over, kid. You're going to be a big deal, blah, blah, blah. And then, like, he doesn't. He just buries him. He hits his finisher, and then he, like, parades around the ring to show off that, like, nobody kicks out of it. And in the business of wrestling, that's known as burying someone, when you, like, go out of your way to make them look bad. And so there's a lot of, like, inwards here. Like, they talk about ribs, and they talk about, like, getting the rub and going over, and you're a mark. And so that goes back to some of the Carney days. A mark is somebody in the audience who you're going to, like, target to buy the story, and they're a mark for getting their money. That's a Carney term, a carnival term. And so That's still a term in wrestling. You have smart marks now, or smarks, which is marks who know a lot about the business. And the way that modern pro wrestling works is that you'll like leak things to wrestling journalists or whatever, or maybe they're just in on it. And so, then you can work the smart mark crowd too, versus like working like your 8-year-old kid who still believes that like John Cena is Superman. You have your smart marks and you have to work them differently. And so it's this whole thing. But like a lot of that stuff is in the book as well. I don't imagine maybe like Shakespeare fans are going to read this as like, oh, a modern retelling of Macbeth. How fun, exciting. And be really pretentious about what it gets wrong from Macbeth. But I think it's geared towards wrestling fans. So like definitely a lot of that language is in there about marks and stuff. So Chuck Frenzy then goes in and he's losing his mind, right? Like he's supposed to get the title and then it doesn't happen. He gets buried instead. And so he murders Van Emerald. Which like, again, I don't feel like I'm giving out spoilers to Crimson Cage. I guess I am. Spoiler alert. Too late. But it's based off Macbeth. So I don't know. That was 500 plus years ago, 500 some years ago. So it's not a new story. And he murders Van Emerald, and then like the promotion that Van Emerald, which was more of a national promotion, a bigger deal, he traveled around the country to the smaller venues and the smaller promotions. So they put the title on Chuck Frenzy, and so he makes this prophecy come true, and it's kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy. And so, but he's then like wants to stay champion, right? And so he goes mad with power. Charlene also goes mad with power, and I would say like she's a pretty bad influence on him throughout the story. A little bit of like this story was done kind of in a different way with the mega powers with Hulk Hogan, who's like a racist and not a good person at all. We don't want to elevate him in any way, shape, or form. And Macho Man Randy Savage and fighting over Miss Elizabeth, and Randy Savage goes crazy, but then also like going after the title and being the number one guy in the promotion. So like this is a very realistic pro wrestling story, and it's a very human story of like chasing goals and like letting the goals like kind of become so problematic in your life that you're not the same type of person before and after. And so Chuck continues to go down this hole of doing anything to defend his title, even though like wrestling is worked. It's predetermined. It's a show, and he just cannot like get out of his own way. Charlene ends up doing a really dangerous move and getting injured because she's trying to like chase the glory that Chuck has and put like women's wrestling on the map, which is also true for the 80s. Like though women wrestlers in the 80s really had to kind of go above and beyond to even be like taken seriously. And we just had the women's revolution a couple of years ago in pro wrestling. That's what it's called. That's not me calling it that. It's literally known as that, the women's revolution. So like, again, just like wrestling has a bunch of misogyny and sexism and racism and homophobia and transphobia and a bunch of like horrible things. Wrestling, when it's done well, is great. Wrestling overall, and again, I put a lot of this on Vince McMahon being an old white man, and the patriarchy like does not do a great job with nuanced story. But the Crimson Cage is great. It's a delightful retelling of Macbeth. It's a modern update of Macbeth, and it like works given the time and place of the setting. Obviously, like it takes wrestling, which is already a little bit of like fabricated art that people always have to like trip over themselves to point out that like it's fake. It's not fake. It's predetermined. It's more real than Game of Thrones, I would argue, because you've got stunt doubles and CGI and all that stuff. That's not in pro wrestling. Although during the pandemic, pro wrestling dabbled in some cinematic stuff because they didn't have audiences and they could pre-record stuff. I'm just going to go off on this tangent and go over time and have a really long video because I'm talking about pro wrestling and it's fun for me. Lucha Underground was a delightful promotion from like 2014, 2015. It was on the air for I think 4 seasons. Lucha Underground, in my opinion, is the best pro wrestling ever. It's my favorite show of all time. It's really hard to get merch or anything. It was just such like a weird, it basically was like taking lucha libre style of wrestling, which is popular in Mexico, and bringing it to a US audience where it's going to be English speaking predominantly. And it was delightful. It was filmed in like this tiny like rundown factory, and it was about like these 7 Aztec tribes fighting over the championship because it was like meaningful to their tribes, and it was like gold from the gods, and it was like man, it was perfect. It just worked. With like Prince Puma was a hero. You had like your like total d bag American idiot Johnny Mundo, who's formerly known as John Morrison, and Jack Evans and PJ Black all being in Worldwide Underground, and they were like the worst, and they were just idiots, and like all these terrible tropes of like what like uh, idiot meathead jock is going to be like. And so that, and then you had like Pentagon Jr., who's like just a pissed off ninja skeleton and it's just going to break people's arms. And like, so that for me was like, continues to hold this special place in my heart for like pro wrestling, as like aware of how ridiculous it is and leaning in just enough to like give it its own universe and story and like make it kind of like unique. And the way it was filmed and the place that it was filmed at, they called it the Temple, but it was like this rundown warehouse in Los Angeles, and like it just worked so amazingly well. You had like people getting eaten by this monster. You had like a Yakuza type faction come in at one point, the Black Lotus tribe, and they got mad about being double crossed, and like it was wonderful. And so again, pro wrestling is kind of this ridiculous, already self-aware that it's ridiculous thing. And so throwing like the Macbeth ghost storyline and like fate storyline, I think was like a lot. It already is a lot because it's pro wrestling, because pro wrestling is a lot. And then you throw in the Macbeth, but like it also worked because pro wrestling is theater. And so I think a really good modern update in a venue that worked well for it, and a way to kind of tell it that worked well. So yeah, I loved it. Obviously, I'm the target audience. I love pro wrestling. I love a good pro wrestling story, and that's what this is. The rise and fall of somebody. It's a very classic human story. It's very realistic for somebody like who can't get out of their own way with success. There's the aspect of self-fulfilling prophecy. He shows like signs of like anxiety and even bordering in psychosis. But like, so yeah, there's an aspect of mental health, but like from a pro wrestling standpoint, modern pro wrestling has some great mental health storylines. Like in AEW, Hangman Adam Page is a cowboy. He's a cowboy character. He's a hangman. He rides a horse to the ring during the big matches that he has. It's very exciting stuff. He's so cool. But his gimmick, what his character is anxious millennial cowboy. Like that's really his gimmick. And AEW told this fantastic 3-year story from the start of the promotion into him becoming world champion, and like him having to overcome, he had a drinking problem because he's a cowboy, right? So he liked to drink, and he lost his friends, and he was trying to prove that he could do it without his friends, but then he had to find new friends and build up, and they believed in him, and they made him believe in himself, and finally he overcame, and it was the person he overcame was one of his former friends, and it was like, ugh. The Hangman Kenny Omega storyline. They were tag team partners, and they split up because Hangman couldn't get out of his own way, and his drinking was a problem, and he lost his friends, and he tried to get them back, and then he had to find like, oh, I could go on and on about that story, and people have like, there's like an hour-long video on YouTube from someone who clipped together all the wrestling stuff to be like, this was a fantastic story, and it was a fantastic story. So modern pro wrestling does some fun things with like real life. And I think real mental health issues and what athletes go through with like sports, having mental health, and like finding a team that supports you and finding a way that it works. And like, so there's I love pro wrestling. There's just so much that it meshes together, and it works when it works well, when it's done well. It just works so amazingly well, and is a great form of storytelling. So yeah, 2 thumbs way up, 5 stars. I don't know that Chuck Frenzy would put on a 5-star match, just saying, for my wrestling fans out there who are interested. But yeah, it's great. I really liked it. I think it's worth a read. It's from like a smaller comic company, so I think it was like $10 for the trade paperback for the whole thing collected. And I'll throw up some artwork too, because I really thought the artwork was great and caught a lot of the vibe. So Crimson Cage, check it out. I really liked it. Drop down in the comments and talk about wrestling, because I have like 2 friends that I know who like wrestling, and always looking for more people who like wrestling to talk to about it, because I'll nerd out about it and get super stoked. So yeah, drop down in the comments and talk about your favorite wrestling memory, or talk about Shakespeare if you want. I'll go off on that too. Thanks for stopping by, checking out my channel, hanging out with me while I get to talk about one of my I used to call it a guilty pleasure, television shows, but I'm really trying to lean in and just own it that like it's cool and it's cool that I like it and I get to because wrestling's awesome. So thanks for stopping by. Peace.